Well, thank you, everyone, for your patience and persistence in listening well. And some of the things that I've talked about, no doubt, some of my pitches missed their target. Some of my arrows missed their target here because we have people here at so many different, coming from so many different points of view and levels of understanding, and I'm been encouraged to aim high and then create in people who don't fully understand some aspiration to reach higher, with the idea that there is some further kind of clarity or understanding that can be reached. I think just as far as the idea that Tsongkhapa's system has an intellectual coherence that, although complicated, can be understood by an unenlightened person, I can, say, well, that's I know that for sure. And it was like, you don't have to be, this is figure outable, right? Even though initially it seems a little bit thorny, it's not. I think we all can do it. So today my outline is, let's see. I wanted to, it dawned on me first that there was one little Mahamudra passage that I'd forgotten to read, and so then I'll start with that and just make a few concluding remarks about that, and then I'll go to my final conclusions, or what do you say, provisionally final conclusions about the not knowing investigation we've been doing, and I think then at that time, I know that there's at least one further question, I can take some questions. Then, and this is seeing how things go through the day. I have some very brief comments maybe to make about Buddhahood, what it could be like or is from the Gelugpa explanation as given by the Dalai Lama. But that's just sort of, following up on other things we've discussed this weekend. And then the last thing I want to do in a more extensive form is basically re-give some Dharma talks that were given by the person, I guess you would say, who first led me into a connection with the Dharma, and that's Jeffrey Hopkins, who's also teaching here at the Abbey by Skype. And he's given me a bunch of unedited transcripts of lots of different Dharma talks that he's done, and I have two of them thoroughly edited up until now, and they're very nice, and it's like a really good starting point for entering into thinking about emptiness. And if we get, and I also would like to, in terms of talking about emptiness, since I can't do, my full explanation, won't fit into the day along with these other things, but just see if I can say two or three quintessential points that would be how Tsongkhapa, given that when we looked at Chandrakirti, you were saying, if you just read this and you don't have Tsongkhapa's magic key in hand, it could lead you into these, and it specifically did lead a bunch of other people into views that seem in the direction of nihilism. So how did what were if we boil down the essence of the genius of his interpretation, not going passage by passage, but the core insights that allowed him to make Chandrakirti, read Chandrakirti in a non-nihilistic way, then I have, actually I was already talking about that at breakfast, but that's what I'll try to do. And so those are my things on my agenda. There's quite a few, but we have almost 3.5 hours, including the 2 sessions. So there was a big handout. I don't know if everybody has that. In fact, I know that not everybody does because there are people here for the first time. But anyway, if people don't have it. There's more? Okay. All right. So, excerpt number 29, which is on page 10. I forgot, I was going over these different things and I got a little bit of a rush and I forgot to read Karma Wangjuk Dorje. So this is the 9th Karmapa from Tibet, obviously late 16th century, and his actual Mahamudra meditation instructions. And so following through on this idea of non-dual practice, which I was talking about in terms of having no judgment, a kind of quality of, you say, spontaneity in the sense of not making any intentional or forced effort, and remaining in the present, that these kinds of qualities are brought forward. And so here's an example. This is his meditation instruction. Don't give the mind work. Instead, relax and release it, and do not meditate on anything. Relaxed, free and easy, release the mind into mere non-distraction. Within a state free of hopes and fears, devoid of any evaluation and judgment, be carefree and open. And within that state, do not pursue the past, do not usher in the future, which I may, maybe think of like as anticipating the future or dreaming about the future, but he's like looking forward to what's about to come. But just stay with the present mind, within a state free of anything to meditate on, and also free from any act of meditation, clearly and directly release the mind. It's very hard for logical people like me to understand how meditation instruction that emphasizes the point of not meditating and not having any object of meditation. But, this has been a very kind of instruction has been very helpful to a lot of people. Reading about the framework for it a little bit, one of the things that's interesting is that, if you take this as the core meditation instruction, but then you look at the rest of the context that it's framed within. One point I made yesterday that I remembered to say is that it's set within a larger, Lamrim sort of framework where you have reliance on the spiritual teacher and training and ethics and so forth. It's not just put out in isolation, go do all you want to do kind of thing. It's very specifically set within a bigger path training context. And then, but then what I forgot to say was that he also gives in the same book instructions on how to monitor your mind while it's doing it to see whether it's doing it properly. Which ends up being just like in our kind of mindfulness, that you practice mindfulness of the object, but then you have this factor, Jim is going with meta-awareness, and we always used to say introspection or vigilance, some kind of introspective vigilance that monitors, checks up on whether your mind is staying, with the object, or is staying attentive, or whether it's been sucked down into the rapids, of your thoughts or emotions, depending, or some combination of them. And so, he's like, first he says, this will release the mind into mere non-distraction. Well, how do you do that? If you release your mind from the outset, mind will be distracted like that, right? So you give an instructor to release the mind into non-distraction, and when people get the idea that meditation is not supposed to be a strained or forced thing, but a kind of opening up, then you then tell them, oh, by the way, you should be checking up to see whether your mind has gone into this, proper kind of open, easy state. And how do you do that? Well, interestingly, he uses the word mindfulness as so we would say we're practicing mindfulness, but we're using Shishin in Tibetan, or introspective vigilance to keep an eye on whether we're sticking with it. But he uses the word mindfulness as the monitoring function. So my point is that this is the core instruction, but then not only is it set around with all the kinds of ethical things and religious framework, so that it's not just misinterpreted as some sort of go out and be the best mobster you can be, but it's, you know, it's within a very specific framework. It's also in a specific meditation instruction framework that gives a more structural, or what do you say, normative or directive. That's the word I'm looking at. It gives a more directive kind of framework within which this kind of opening up or releasing the mind is set. And also, it's not that, so if you just relax your mind into mere non-distraction, what is it supposed to be resting on? And you know, one way of thinking about that, as we've been talking about in the way that Tsongkhapa is attacking, is that you have this philosophy that nothing ultimately is knowable, that there is nothing, either nothing itself is the final nature of things, or that setting your mind in nothingness is at least the closest that we can get to being in accord with the nature of reality, and therefore we should just take nothing in some sense or another, set our minds in not anything. And but actually, even though it sounds like this, you know, when you read these instructions, that's what they're kind of going for, the intention is to lead the mind into there's a goal behind it, which is not mere nothingness, but at least in the terms of the system itself, is to bring the mind into focus on the mind's own nature. Yeah, but he doesn't come right out and say that in these instructions. But that's the idea: is that you're going to, you know, not by focusing on particular objects to which the mind becomes attached, like the film we saw, or, you know, the breakfast we ate, or what we'll have for lunch, and so forth. But instead, to just like open it up into this spacious realm. The idea is that you'll become more and more aware of, or gain intimacy with, how about that, the basic nature of the mind itself. And that, in, you know, his system would be related to reflexive self-awareness, the mind coming to intimately know the mind itself in that very moment, right? Okay. All right, so I kind of forgot to say that before, but that's like sort of fuller thing that I wanted to say. Okay, so then, having finished my leftover unfinished business, I can go to the last part of the not knowing talk, which is provisional thoughts about what we can take away from our investigation of not knowing, or what maybe what I'm just saying, what I'm up to the point of being ready to take away from it. First of all, and I think the easiest thing to understand, is that knowing that we don't know how things are, and I mean that in a very broad kind of different sense. It could be like the basic nature of things, or how things are with another person. Just knowing how much we don't know about how things are at the ultimate and conventional level is the best starting point for learning. And a lot of times we miss that and like get a false idea that we know more than we do. So, for example, it was like we just started by setting our motivation, right? And a lot of times when we do things, well, this is my experience. I don't know yours, right? I won't presume to say. My experience is that when people ask me why I did something, I can quickly make up some reason. And the relationship between that and what my actual motivation is extremely sketchy. I'm just talking about myself now. I don't know about you, but I don't actually know is the answer, the correct, honest answer. But I will be happy to make something else up so that I will not seem like just a complete fool. And this is true of so many things. It's like goes on all the time. We do stuff and then we don't really know why, but then once in a while someone will ask us, and then we'll have to come up with a reason. And I think this is just very pervasive. So it's important to sort of, what do you say, try to become, realizing that we don't know what the motivation is for a lot of our behavior. starting with that, knowing that we don't know about our own behavior, then investigate, what's motivating it, and think about, whether those are motivations we really want to have, and whether other motivations might lead us into a different kind of pattern of action. So that's one kind of, knowing that we don't know, is knowing that we don't know about our own motivations. There's also knowing that we don't know in terms of like investigating things. Like we have, like I'm referring back to the ultimate root text here, Joan Halifax, is like says, don't have not knowing means no attachment to opinions and so forth. So, yeah, we have a lot of like thinking that we know about what's right about this and what's wrong about that in terms of just almost any subject. There's a few subjects and we're willing to admit that we don't know about, Somebody says, what's your opinion of the latest string theory development? We might just be saying, I don't know, But if somebody says, what do you think about the upcoming referendum in the state of Washington, which I don't even know if there is one, but suppose there were, then most people will have an opinion and will be, strongly invested in it, like almost automatically before they've even studied the whole thing. And so we get very attached to kind of our opinions about things, and one of the ways that, and which is an extension of basically being attached to appearances. It's like, this is how it seems to my mind, so I'm just going to rest with that and then reinforce it. Gives bulwark, pulled up some bulwarks behind my a priori opinion. And in the Lehigh teachings, From Here to Enlightenment, one student came in to the Dalai Lama and said, you have said that we relate to events based on our own perceptions rather than based on reality, and we need to differentiate our perceptions from reality. But how are we supposed to know reality except based on, or being at least influenced by, our perceptions? And so, I thought, well, that's going to be a tough one, for His Holiness. So obviously he'd already thought about this. He says, generally, if you look at a single thing or a single event, and that means either, a political issue or a question about the nature of reality, if you look at any single thing or event from only one angle, then you don't get the full picture. In order to understand an event, you have to look at it from various angles. Even in the case of a physical thing, just knowing one of its dimensions doesn't give you the full picture. I was thinking about this in shop class anciently. We did these drawings. Or in architecture, you can make an accurate picture of what Chenrezig Hall would look like from one angle. But not be able to reconstruct it, right? In this way, with all things, so I take that to be conventional and ultimate things, right? You have to examine things from various points of view, along different dimensions, from different perspectives, because when you see just one aspect, there will always be a gap between appearance and reality. And this is why investigation and analysis is critical. Only through investigation can we reduce the gap between appearance and reality. When we take things at face value, we're never going to get closer than we'll just accept things as they appear to us naively, essentially, right? And then fight with other people who are looking at them from a different angle. Right? I think that's really important, and I like the way he said it too. So if you apply that to the ultimate reality question, because this applies to, it's very clear that it applies both at the ultimate and conventional, but if you think about that our basic problem of cyclic existence is we're just, things are forcefully appearing to us as though they were objectively set up from their own side out there, and without doubting that or investigating it, we just take it at face value and assent to and reinforce this idea that, oh yeah, these things have, each thing, including myself, has its own, independent objective reality, and of course that becomes the basis for all of the other afflictions to arise. Like when somebody cuts in front of me in line, then it's very clear that they're objectively existent as the son of a bitch, and that it would be only natural for me to smack them, but since I'm a good Buddhist, I may refrain on this particular occasion, but they should watch out. And you know what I'm saying? And so it's very, and then war is this extension of the same thing and so forth. So, yeah. So, if we, become familiarity with some of the reasonings in Madhyamaka, then they're irritating to us because they go against the grain of how we're used to thinking about and seeing things, and our mind gets a little bit, this is so silly. It's like you just want to find some excuse to go and think about something else because it goes against the grain of how we're used to seeing things. And Jeffrey, who we'll talk about more later today, he used to say that he would go around, once he started becoming familiar with this, and just say to himself as his mantra, "I am wrong." I am wrong. Like everything about how I'm seeing things, how I'm taking things to be as it's arising in my mind. Wrong, 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 wrong. Right? And this was his idea of practice of trying to undermine this sort of not that buildings exist, but how they seem to exist. It's constantly everything that we're perceiving is appearing in the wrong way. So, going back to Joan, in her Roshi Joan and her 3 tenets from Bernie, it's like the first one is not knowing, and then the second one is bearing witness, and the third one is compassionate action. So if we understand not knowing as knowing that we don't know how things actually exist, then it's very clear that that's a great starting point, and that bearing witness means coming into intimacy, or you use a Zen word, into deeper familiarity with how it is that things actually do exist. And that makes perfect sense as a second step. And then the third is that based on having this deeper kind of intimacy with things, then we rise from meditation and engage in compassionate action, right? So, now the 3 tenets seem more coherent than they did at the beginning. So that's how you could think about it, to me, the 3 tenets in terms of the practice of the path. But also, she's not, teaching people the practice of the path there in her workshops. She's teaching them how to work with dying people, and they're not Buddhists by and large who are there being taught. So it also has to do with working with one another, right? So recognizing that we don't really know. So what's going on with the other person? This is harder for some of us to admit than others, I think. It's not the same as inherent existence thing, because we all have this, naturally strong sense that things are objectively real. But some people have more invested in an image of themselves as someone who knows what's going on with other people. And some of us start out knowing that we don't know and finding it all very mysterious, right? And but that's what she's saying, is these people go into the houses of people who are dying, and the relatives are grieving, and they have to begin from a space of knowing that they don't know these people. They don't actually know what these people are feeling. They don't actually know what they think about dying. They don't actually know what they're going through, not having remembered any of their own prior deaths themselves, right? And so they don't actually know. And even if they have a lot of training and expertise, which is important, they have to sort of operate from that position of recognizing that there's always a lot of details in the terrain that they don't know. And then that makes it possible for them to gain some new information, quote, bear witness, right? To see what's really going on with the people, to not just say, oh, this is stage 2, or this is stage 3 of this, that, or the other thing that we learned about in school, but to bear witness, or to actually see the new, to learn something. If you just always go thinking that you're the expert, then you never actually encounter the other person as a person and learn something about the nuances of their situation. And of course, this is one of the things, speaking personally, right, that people find very irritating and unhelpful, right, to feel that you've been pigeonholed and categorized, and that someone who's coming either from a religious point of view or from a medical point of view has already knows everything about your situation more than you do, and will now give you some instruction about it. This is not the way to go, all right? Okay, so, an example of this is that throughout Roshi Jones' book, Being with Dying, she constantly chafes at the idea of a good death, and she's sort of saying, well, we have to sort of get past this idea that there's like the good death and the bad death and the right way to die and the wrong way to die, and be much more open in how we approach these situations. Leaving somebody's house, and that person gets a B-. They died pretty well, but not as well as they could have. I would like to see improvement in the next lifetime. Yeah. No, she's trying to say, we don't really know, right, what's going on here, and we have to try to help people, but we're there to help, but we can't presume to know exactly what's going on. We have to be open to how much we don't know. And she gives this example of this person who while she's dying, the whole time she has a terminal illness, her main mantra is, I'm not dying. And initially it appears that, this is obviously denial, but she's blissfully happy and maintains up until her last words, which are, I'm not dying, this kind of radiant sense of happiness while she's dying. And so, Halifax intentionally brings this example forward because she wants people to see now what grade do we give what grade do we give this death? It's like the best thing is to say, well, we don't really know. We don't know. We're not inside that person's mind. We're not we don't have psychic powers to understand that. We're just there to try to help. Right? Okay, so that's one. Not knowing means really in a serious way recognizing both in regard to ultimate reality and in regard to interpersonal situations where we're trying to help people just how much we don't know. And number two, I would say, she says, she's talking about not knowing means not having attachment to goals or specific objectives. And I have to understand that her intention is to try to help people as much as possible. And, so it's not like not having a rigid goal, not being attached to goals doesn't mean that, you don't really care whether you're helping people or not. So I think we definitely have to have an aspiration, as I was saying last class, that, that what makes our lives worthwhile is having a motivation to try to benefit other beings as much as we can, and not just frittering away these seconds, breaths. But then within that, the question is, what kinds of goals do you fix your mind on? There's a lot of evidence that setting goals leads to people being more productive and more effective instead of knowing what it is that they're trying to accomplish. The problem isn't goals then per se. It's a kind of rigidity or attachment about what specific things, so I want to help people, so I've decided that what these people need is a better water treatment plant. And even if I have to ruin their healthcare system and strip all the money out of their schools, I will get them the better water treatment plant. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there's a lot of really good recent examples of this that just jump right out at you. Because this goal setting philosophy, totally pervasive in business and in university and so forth, we're constantly having to make goals as institutions, as sub-institutions, as individuals, and then people are just always being evaluated by one another in terms of how well they set these sort of concocted goals that they were forced to make up all the time. And so it goes too far. And good examples of this are General Motors, which set a goal of recapturing post-bankruptcy the largest market share, and by rating all their managers in terms of how well they achieved that goal, they ended up ignoring evidence that their cars were killing people and should be recalled. But the people weren't if the people who would speak up about that would get a D on their goal achieving because, that wasn't one of the goals that had been set out. And another example, which is just jumps out, is the Veterans Administration thing, where they made really clear, we're going to take care of these veterans. That's our goal. We want to help the veterans. And so our goal to achieve that is that everyone will be seen within 14 days. And then all the managers and supervisors are rated on how well they achieve that goal. And of course, what happens is people, they create deceptive systems so that it will appear that this goal is being achieved and that they will get good grades and more raises, when in fact, people don't get in for months in some cases because it's not actually possible with the resources and the structure they have to meet that goal, so they just create an appearance that it's being met. There's so many examples like this, so that you have something that's good, but that because people have a kind of rigidity about it, then it turns into a serious harm, which in these particular cases actually killed people, right? That kind of serious harm. So anyway, that's my thoughts about that. I could give more examples about the pitfalls of goal setting, but anyway, I'm not against goal setting. It's the rigidity about people, the way people take goals. Then rigid expectations, not having, it's people, I think it's the way our minds are, based on past experience, when certain kinds of things happen, we tend to anticipate what kinds of things might happen next, and that's probably adaptive. But we have to also put that within the context of knowing how much we don't know and how uncertain even our best expectations are, right? Everybody knows how that works with the weather. But it's still we have a lot of expectations, I expect my luggage will arrive when I do, and even when it doesn't, then I still think it will the next time, and it still doesn't. You know what I'm saying? My favorite story about this, which I think Joseph Goldstein told a long time ago, was a story from a period of pogrom in Russia, and Jews were being persecuted, and there was a rabbi who walks across the square every morning on his way over to the synagogue, and the police are harassing him, and so they see him going over there, and then they accost him, they halt him on the street and grab him and say, "Rabbi, where do you think you're going?" And he said, "I don't know." And and so they said, "You're lying to us. We know. Every day you go over to the synagogue. You're lying to the police." And they throw him in jail, and they close the door. He says, "See, you never know." I laughed when I heard that too, and I was like, I could never forget that story. I think I heard it 30 years ago. Yeah. So anyway, that's a really good one to remember about. We can't help but have some expectations, but we have to hold them really loosely and understand that they float within a big space of not knowing, where lots of other things could happen, right? And I guess some of these things do overlap with one another. I guess I've sort of already talked about this in a way, but not having, when we're dealing with other people, a very rigidly preconceived agenda. I find when I go to meetings at work, I usually do try to plan some idea what I intend to accomplish, and otherwise nothing gets accomplished. But if you go to the meeting and you see that some people are really upset about something else and want to talk about it, you don't want to just hit the gavel, right? You have to respond to the situation as it arises. The same thing if you're a hospice worker, right? That's what she's trying to say. You have a certain agenda, but stuff always is changing, and both with the medical situation and the emotional situation. You have to be nimble, flexible, and your skilled responses have to be ones that are ready to change. They can't be locked in like a robot or something like that. We're not robots, so let's be better than robots and not try to make ourselves more into robots. This is actually kind of related to what Dale Hartkemeyer, the Soto priest I was talking about, told me. I asked him, what do you think this not knowing means? And that's what he talked about, is sort of a dynamic, flexible responsiveness, rather than having, here's where you are in terms of what Tsongkhapa would say, and give them a letter grade kind of response to people. That relates to what I was talking about, that the maps that we make, the conceptual maps, the systems and so forth, are the actual territory of reality, and the reality is not just some abstract thing, but like other people and how they are. And so we can't ever have a perfect representation within our own minds of another person's experience, even though we try to get some better maps. There are better and worse maps, right, of particular people in the world in general. I'm not saying there aren't, but it's just that you have to realize that even the best maps are not the world. And so your best idea of how another person is not actually the complexity of that person. So we use reason and try to figure out as much as we can, and we use our kind of sensitivity to the person and the situation, and try to understand the best we can and respond empathetically. And we have to, but there's always there's a space where that ends, and there's something that we don't know, and we have to we have to remember that. That's all I'm saying. So that implies a kind of humility, and then we have to do something. Even though we know that we don't know what would be, and this is a point I think that's sort of implied in some of my emails with Venerable Chödrön about this. So she was making the point is that it's really hard to know what would be a helpful thing to say to a dying person or a bereaved person or the spouse of a dying person or something like that. How you don't know, and so it's very easy to say the wrong thing because you don't really know what you have no magic, omniscient knowledge of what would be the most helpful thing. So sometimes, out of best intentions, you might not say something you should have said, or say something that hit the person the wrong way. So, yeah, that's right. You have to you have to accept that, and then be open to still being motivated by try to help, and making it clear that you want to help. And that you have to try to do something to help, which could include not saying anything. Yeah, just being with people and being quiet sometimes works better than feeling this pressure. Like the Buddha holding up the flower. And it's I can't do it, right? I try to do it. I was I always have to keep talking. But, if you're there sitting with somebody who's dying, it's a lot of times when maybe, resisting that pressure to say something consoling is absolutely the best thing to do. Yeah. So yeah, that's my point, is that even you don't know, because you're motivated by compassion, you have to go out on a limb and say something. I'm playing off of Katagiri Roshi's, you have to say something. You have to say something, which could mean silence or actual words, but you have to engage in some way to try to act to help the other person. And then there's this idea, which is not unrelated to what I've already been talking about, but it's sort of focusing a little bit more of attunement, trying to get a better understanding of what the other person is feeling, make a connection with what the other person is feeling. And we have abilities to do this, but we may, as a book that Dale loaned me yesterday, makes very clear, a lot of people have a tendency to overestimate their ability to understand what other people are feeling. That was interesting to me, because I don't think that that's my fault generally. I have a whole bunch of other ones. But it's clear that some people do have this tendency to overestimate their knowledge of what other people are feeling. And so attunement, I don't know, if you see how if you have an emotionally sensitive person, it develops a certain ego idea of themselves, self-image of themselves as that I'm the person who sees other people's minds, then they can become they will be sure to make mistakes at some point about like thinking they know what's going on with somebody else when they really don't. This holiness talks in about looking to see what would be helpful to other people and providing them what is helpful to them. This means you have to pay attention and not just have a priori idea, a set knowing about, oh, well, the Dharma is the best thing, so I'll give them that. But it might not be the best thing right then if they don't have any water, and so forth. So I don't know. Somebody was talking to me yesterday about this story about the dad responding to the daughter and how he does this strange spontaneous thing of like mock mirroring her anger to show the 18-month-old that he knows what she's feeling, but then doing it with a kind of a laugh to let her know that he's not really angry at her, but that he's reflecting her anger, and then he can go into making a connection with her. I thought it was like a really good little model of what, if you can do that with an 18-month-old, how we can try to be with each other. And apparently, it's like, okay, so when kids get really angry, the older instruction was that we should get really calm. But one of the problems, of course, with that is that then you're setting up an emotional tug of war between the child's anger and your anger. So I don't know. Apparently, some people are finding it skillful to respond to temper tantrums with a kind of mock anger, which identifies with and mirrors the feelings of the child, and then the child understands that their feelings are being they see an echo of their own feelings in the other person, and then they can hear you better when you're empathizing with them and trying to get them to calm down. That what I just said is a generalization of the little story that I told from yesterday, which I didn't know, but apparently people are doing that systematically now. So, because we don't know as much as we might like to think we know about what's going on with other people, and we recognize that not knowing to the extent that we do, you have to ask them. You have to talk to them. You say, it's like, well, one of the things that's been, some people will just say, well, how's it going? And it's hard, in passing to like, it's not really clear how much of an invitation that is. Oh, great, But then, like, some people, like, if the setting is right, the context is right, and the interest seems genuine, then it can be helpful to have someone who really wants to know how you are. Do you know what I'm saying? And, when I go to my UU church sometimes and people say, oh, how are you? It's like there's all these people coming and going. It's like, I don't know if this is even a serious question, right? So then the person is like maybe seriously wanting to know how I am, but I'm just getting irritated because there's no way that I can answer that question on the fly, So then I have to work on that. So, but asking people, how they're doing, what is, like, for example, what seemed more helpful to you and what seemed less helpful to you, right, in this situation? Then I found, when people are sort of have a claim, real curiosity, not just a passing obligation to feel like they're being concerned, then people like to talk about themselves, of course, and their own feelings. Everybody does. I think this is one of the best ways that we can help people is ask them questions about themselves. All the time, people just like respond to that better than anything. Yeah. So of course, if you want to try to take care of people in a general sense or a Dharma sense or a hospice sense or whatever, you have to show an interest in them, an actual interest, not a pro forma interest. One of the things that can be, counterproductive is to go through the motions of doing that so that you can think of yourself as a good person. It's not, I don't know. Yeah. So, let's see. I have a little bit more about this. So, she says, not being attached to concepts, doctrines, ideas, and so forth. So as part of not knowing. So I always say one of these things that we've already talked about is not being attached to certain verbal formulations of the Dharma. Let's be clear. I am extremely grateful for certain verbal formulations of the Dharma. You know, it's like, well, if we didn't have some verbal formulations of the Dharma, how will we understand this at all? You know, it's like, okay, that's hugely important. But people have all different ways of talking about these things, and some ways of talking about these things seem to be better for other people, even if they're incomprehensible to me. And I can take an approach in which I say, well, that koan's obviously wrong. That way of talking about Mahamudra is clearly, a fallacy or a wrong path. But it's like, maybe that isn't. Maybe that's just a reflection of my kind of like identifying with my understanding of, Tsongkhapa's system, and then building up, a position from which I can criticize others without actually trying to understand what they're doing and how what they're doing could be helpful. I guess I would say one thing is like, this is like, start with the principle of charity. Charity meaning like that, an interpretive charity, I mean, not donation charity. Like, so we don't assume that everybody's saying something good. We don't assume that everybody's saying the same thing we're saying in other words. But we also don't assume that because they use different words, that they're wrong and unhelpful. It could be that those different words in the bigger context, which we obviously haven't studied because we're on this one, right? That within that larger context, that way of talking is actually really helpful and might be a way of pointing at or leading towards a similar kind of liberating understanding. And His Holiness talks about this kind of thing all the time. I don't think it's just ex officio. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't think it's fake that he pretends this because he's the Dalai Lama and has to think he's sincere, right? But yeah, anyway, he says, of course, all these things about how good scholars often will disagree on the verbal level. Almost you might say that's their job. And but they may have the same underlying meaning nonetheless. And so not knowing, one thing it can mean is that even though we have to have our own way of talking, and otherwise we wouldn't have a way of understanding the Dharma, that we can't be so attached to it that our main use of the Dharma is to judge other people's wrong ways of talking. I'll just give you an example in my own case. I don't know, whether whether you're buying it or not, but my friend Jay Garfield, who is, translated, Tsongkhapa's Ocean of Reasoning and worked extensively with Gelugpa teachers. And he came and gave a talk at my university in which he said that the basic truth here is that the nature of things is that they have no nature. And I'm going, why are you saying that? Please explain how the first nature in that sentence is not the same as the second nature in that sentence, because that's what Tsongkhapa would want you to do, so that you were saying something that made sense. And it was like, I don't know, it was like visceral to some extent that I just like didn't like that way of talking. You know what I'm saying? But then you can get to a certain space, like where I've been able to get to a place where, you can say, okay, that's one way of looking at things. That's one way of talking about things. That's one way of using language. It's not Tsongkhapa's way, but it's not that Jay is, from his point of view, he doesn't think he's contradicting Tsongkhapa. He thinks he's just using a different way of expressing the same exact thing, right? And maybe that's true. I don't know. I mean, Tsongkhapa is committed to the idea that everything, we can work things out with reason in terms of how ultimate reality exists. But then there do come to be certain problems, in talking about how an omniscient mind functions and so forth. And then the Gelugpa scholars will say, Chebar Jao, which means like, well, we still need to do further analysis of this. Well, you've been analyzing it for 250 years. There's still not, a complete explanation of exactly how omniscience operates, and there's still these questions, and maybe that's because, you know, that you can't make any map that perfectly describes the territory of reality, and you should hold on to yours, you know, seriously, but not grippingly. Yes. So, yeah. So another example, because this can go the other way too. Like some people become, oh, those Gelupas are so bad because they don't understand that the Dharma is basically transrational and paradoxical, right? And then that becomes like it's like we're against dogma, but their dogma is this paradox dogma. And they can be just as like or worse than people from our side. Yeah. I wrote in my two truths, doctrinaire adherence to any single interpretive formula can impoverish our reading. Say of Chandrakirti, trans-rational paradox becomes a pat answer, as it has for many Buddhist and non-Buddhist interpreters of Buddhism. Then learning about what Tsongkhapa said and taking it seriously can revitalize our reading of Sutra and Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti. And these texts can open up in surprisingly convincing new ways. On the other hand, it's clear that what is supposed to be Tsongkhapa's system, institutionalized in the monastic textbooks, gives really pat answers to Gelupas, some of whom have not actually read Tsongkhapa very much themselves because they've been debating on their monastic textbooks. And of course it closes down this close study of the Indian classics that His Holiness is always paying tribute to. So at worst then you get a kind of defanged Madhyamaka whose insistence on the validity of conventional reality just serves to confirm the socio-political and samsaric status quo, which of course is not intended to do. But if you read it, you know, in this kind of like, okay, this is our official set of answers to all things, then you can end up in that kind of misunderstanding. And so Jangya and Dendar Hlaramba sort of are put in the position of having to remind their fellow Gelupas about this danger. In other words, they know that this is a problem, and recognize it, you know, and so try to warn people against it when they say things like they warn their fellow Gelupas, don't take these concrete appearances as givens. In other words, don't think just because Tsongkhapa says, oh yeah, tables exist, that means, whew, that's good. Don't have to worry about that. Now there's this other thing inherent existence. I don't really know about that, but you know, apparently we can get rid of that. So now we're back to the table. Okay, all good. And that, I mean, I'm not making this up, right? That's how a lot of people end up reading or misreading what Tsongkhapa was saying. So Tsongkhapa is very systematic. You know, he's a systematist. He wants to create the like organized system, and that really appeals to me. And then also the you know, recipe approach of Lamrim. You know, here's the stages of things you're supposed to do first, second, fourth, because you get, you know, clear instructions. Not everybody's mind is like that. That doesn't actually work equally, I think, for every single person. And there's some people who react against it, I think, that like, and that's where you get this kind of tension between the book people and the yogic people, or the siddhas. The siddhas and the Nalanda people actually overlap some, which is good because that makes a certain point too. But there's a big difference between them also, and I think that's why we don't have big, you know, a big there's Saraha's system, you know. It's like you have these little things that are passed down, right? And this thinking about the people who are anti-systematic, you know, who's non-grasping at system also becomes kind of like a grasping at non-system, right? It made me think of a couple of little things. On the non-system side, there's that famous idea from the poet John Keats, right, about negative capability. Apparently he just wrote this in a letter to his brother and as a kind of blow-off thing. And he's thinking about why are some people so great at literature and some people are so bad. And he's saying, basically, what quality goes to form a man of achievement, and especially literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously, I mean negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. It's like, oh, well, that's a different kind of mind, right? It's a person who's like, you don't want to irritably be grasping after facts and reasons or answers, but they want to be sort of resting in the complexity or the mystery of, of things as they are. I guess I'm trying to explain. He understood that like lesser poets were what set them on the wrong path is they were always trying to get some single answer, some single magic formula or truth that everything could be boiled down and would be the answer to everything. And then, so their minds, he said, become like private, narrow highways. They don't have a kind of flexibility or openness to the actual complexity of the world, right? So that's what he was trying to express in that. And I think, before I get back to what Tsongkhapa's view on that, a good example is the poem by Isa, which is famous, super famous. We read passage number 2 in the handout, which is, okay, so Isa's a Pure Land Buddhist, obviously, serious Buddhist. It's not passage number 2, sorry. 22? 22. Yeah, so this dewdrop world, or this world of dew, is a world of dew, and yet. So apparently, Isa didn't get rich writing haiku, but he just kept writing them. 20,000 haiku that he wrote in his lifetime, which is way more than the other famous haiku writers. And this particular one, he had children, pretty much all of his children and his wife died before he did. And after one young daughter died of smallpox, he wrote the poem about the world of dew is a world of dew, and yet. So this is considered to be, I would say this is like expressing the kind of thing that Keats is talking about, because the first 2 lines are saying, okay, these Buddhists, of which whom I'm one, the Buddha has taught that this world is like a drop of dew quickly passing away. And he's right. That's the second line. He's exactly right. There isn't any quarreling with the correctness of the transitory nature of all things. And then he says, and yet, which is but even though that's true and not in any way contradicting it, we can't help but grasp or cling or suffer or hold on, or be pained by, even when we know that these things are going to pass away, it doesn't stop us from magically say, well, of course that would have happened. Now I don't feel anything. It's not, what I'm saying? It's well, Buddha was right. If he'd stopped it, Buddha was sure right. It wouldn't have been a profound expression of, the human condition in some sense. And, okay, so that's kind of that sounds all very good if you're interested in sort of expressing the human condition, but what if you want to have, a coherent doctrine or a system of explanation? Then you're back to the problem of irritable grasping after facts and certainties, right? And as Keats would put it. And then Tsongkhapa has this great little poem in Lamrim Chenmo, which is number 32 in here, which he's telling people, to not give up on systems. He says, my friends who study the profound Madhyamaka texts. I like it that he says my friends. That makes me feel warmer. Although it is hard for you to posit the dependent arising of cause and effect within the absence of inherent existence. In other words, it might just seem impossible. It might be said, the more we understand emptiness, the more it seems to undermine dependent arising, and we think we just have to pick one or the other. But even though this is so hard, it's better to take the approach of saying, well, that's the Madhyamaka system. Even if I don't understand it yet, that is the system. And not take some other thing that, and say that it's the Madhyamaka system. Because, in that case, you'll end up finding yourself drawn to a non-system. In that case, you must continue to study or analyze, Chebar Jao, as the Tibetans would say. And coming to the end of this, I think for the same kind of reasons that we've talked about yesterday, especially, first of all, we need to have conceptual thought in order to deal with. We need to have language. We need to have conceptual thought. We need to have logic. We need to have analysis. So this is like made very clear. And the problem is like a little bit that some of us who buy that as I have, and then you start to forget the way in which it's always in some way wrong. Because it's and Dharmakirti's is this is like why this troubling passage from Dharmakirti that we read is so perfect, because here's the guy who's like, set out the basic, structures, although of course they get modified, but he's made the basic outline of how Buddhist logic and Buddhist epistemology will work. And he's written all these different texts which are extremely analytical about how analysis should proceed and so forth. And yet he's saying, that conceptuality is ignorance. And so it's sort of like he's not drinking his own Kool-Aid in some sense. You know what I'm saying? He's like, oh, well, this stuff is indispensable. You have to have it. He says that. He says, we accept the necessity of some of these wrong thoughts, but the thoughts themselves cannot be taken at face value because they're always involved this inaccurate lumping together of things which are not actually the same. Like I have this, it's like a an ice cream cone in my mind where the real thing, and then when I see one on the street, it's like just an instantiation of the real thing, which is the ice cream cone in my mind. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, oh, I have the camera is real. That just happens to be a particular case of it. Do you know what I'm saying? We start to feel like our thoughts are more real, and then the stuff around in the world, counts as real to the extent it exemplifies things that we already have categories for in our mind. Oh, I think people are very much like that. And that's where you get Platonism from. And that, like the idea that these things are not really real. They don't exist the way they appear. Why? Because they're expressions or manifestations of some ideal forms. There's like an ideal camera. That's what I'm thinking of when I say camera to myself. And this is just one, pretty good, example of such. And that's how we can talk and refer to things and understand the world. And of course, like Dharmakirti, this is exactly what Dharmakirti, he was trying to refute the Hindu equivalent of Platonism and say, no, language doesn't refer to, universals that are permanent. That's what he was cutting against, He was saying these universals are constructs that we're imagining. And then we need them, but we shouldn't mistake them for the actuality of specific things. So, and in that way, Dharmakirti is like teaching us the importance and the methods for using reason and logic, and at the same time embedding this kind of reminder in there that we can't mistake it for the actuality that it's trying to help us to understand, that we need it to help us to understand. Yeah, exactly. That's enough. Yeah, so let's go to the question phase. That's, I think somebody has a question. That's the end of not knowing. So I'm going to talk about emptiness, but then before that we have questions about not knowing. Yes?
Knowing you don't know.
Yeah.
But I have to not know what I don't know.
Oh, right. Well, I'm not trying to do one of those paradox things. I'm just simply saying, like, understanding that there's like a lot that we don't understand. Yeah. And you're right that, I don't know, we're getting into Donald Rumsfeld territory here, but yeah, you're right. There's some things that we don't know that we don't know that we don't know, right? But we know that there are some things that we don't know that we don't know that we don't know. We know that. You see what I'm saying? I'm like, well, you do anyway. You just pointed it out. You know that there's some things that you don't know that you haven't yet figured out that you don't know. So that's good. Right. So that, no, and I guess my point about that is like that so part of modernity is the valuation of curiosity, like wanting to know. That, to me, this is like a crucial part of like how we get to the modern world and what the modern world takes as a core value, curiosity. And so I think Buddhism overlaps with this a great deal, because it's like, yeah, we want to know who we are. We want to know how to help people. We want to know where misery comes from, right? In my way of understanding Buddhism, knowing is better, and all knower is best, right? And not knowing is of a certain sort is a root of suffering. So in that way, there's an overlap between valuing curiosity and Buddhism. A spirit of inquiry, so to speak, is part of the Buddhist tradition. But the difference is like that. So we wouldn't take curiosity per se as the core value in some sense. What way I've tried to express it is that we should subject our curiosity to curiosity about what motivates it, what good will be achieved by getting the answer to particular questions, given that there's always, and when I say this to my science friends, and they say, yeah, but sometimes we research things just for pure curiosity and we don't know where it will lead, and then it ends up leading to something amazing. Well, yeah, that's true. I mean that's historical fact, right? So, but still, the basic situation is that you want to say that like curiosity generically is always a good thing, right? People can actually literally waste their lives in a sense without helping anybody by being devotees of their curiosity about things that no one of which ever leads to help for another person or for themselves, actually. So I was like skeptical or meta-curious, Why are you so curious about that? Well, why do I want to know about this? It's like if there's a reason that relates to a good motivation, or you can see a good end in sight about understanding this and that's one thing. Then if there isn't, you can still maybe have an open question about the pure science issue. But you still have to, you know what I'm saying, you have to ask questions about motivation for things, because sometimes it becomes really clear that stuff is going nowhere. It's like, yeah, it becomes a kind of entertainment or pastime, I was going to say. Wikipedia. Well, that's true. The whole thing with curiosity is different now, right? Because we can know not anything, but we can know, it seems like almost anything, anytime we want. Yes?
So maybe it's not a just a clarification, but for the tenets of blessings and all that, there's not knowing, fearing, reverence, and then the loving actions. Some decided to assume that is the evolution of the first two, and it's the natural translation to the first two, that you can have these outpouring of loving actions, have the not knowing, but in my experience, that's just an extreme amount of cultivation.
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, since Halifax is a non-system person, and the entirety of the systematic structure of the book is those three tenets, then I can't say here's the section where she explains the Lamrim for developing loving actions. But what I can point to is that under the rubric of this, she teaches these doctors and nurses who are not Buddhists how to cultivate universal love. I mean, she teaches them, loving kindness meditation, and she teaches them how to cultivate universal compassion in meditation. I think it would be wrong to say that they're assuming that this is just sort of an automatic. Yeah. Yes. Sure.
When you know, when you don't know, is that the knowing of the experts in this knowing, this understanding?
Yes, I think so. That also it depends on what you're talking. Yeah, if you're talking about the basic nature of reality, like so most of the time people don't think about it, but they just implicitly take it for granted that things exist the way they appear, and things appear as just as though they were out there independently of us, setting themselves up, and oftentimes also as though they were not changing. Some things is a little clearer than other things, but river or something like that. But yeah, it's like the tree doesn't, even the tree, let alone the wall, doesn't appear to be changing. And so if I don't stop to think about it, I'll just take it that it's not changing, right? And so yeah, it's like we have to recognize that. And then people stop to think about it, and they start developing ideas which can confirm their innate wrong, right, philosophies about which try to save. Really, I didn't think about it like that. It's like we have this strong innate tendency to think of things as permanent and self-existent. And then so when people start thinking and they get a few doubts about that, one move you can make is to develop some kind of philosophy about how, oh yeah, they really are permanent, even though it sort of seems like they're not. You know, right? In the case of a person, that would be our eternal soul, but there's other, in the case of a wall, it might be the Platonic form for the wall. I think that's the way to think about, because most of us are not crypto-Platonists, except in this sense that I was referring to, which is that we kind of, well, I do anyway. I don't know about you, right? But I tend to believe in my thoughts, like the thing about the camera and the ice cream, and I sort of I know those intimately. And then I can. That's how I am able to make sense of what I'm perceiving, because I link it to the real thing, which is the image in my brain. And to the extent that you can take that kind of way that the mind works and then build a philosophy which says, oh yeah, and that's the way it really is. And then you have Platonism. Yeah.
Earlier on you were listing things that you thought were included in don't have this idea of not knowing. For you, they were separate things, and other someone who was just if not, that's fine.
Yeah. Actually, I don't have that. Tried to boil down the number of papers I were bringing, and the piece of paper on which I actually had that list, I do not have. Yeah, maybe I'll bring that in the afternoon then. Okay. Yeah, I didn't put the quotes from Halifax in this collection, and then the notes where I have that I didn't bring. Yes.
Yesterday you also talked a little bit about emotional intelligence, but there was a counterpart, something about a
Oh yeah, thanks. So yeah, that was I came at that from talking to Venerable Tarba, and I got started to think about okay, so people have these moments where they spontaneously do something that's extremely helpful or almost seems perfectly responsive, but they didn't consciously plan to do that and don't know where it came from. Okay, so we had the example of the dad with the baby is a good one, but then there are other examples. Some people may have experienced this. It doesn't happen a lot, but so it happens especially in domains where you have some past experience, but then you're not, this is my idea, but if you have some past experience in a certain domain, and then you're not rigidly imposing the grid that comes from that experience, but you're just sort of resting in the situation with that person, then you get this you can arise a situation where you sort of make a response that's based on something that you haven't consciously thought out, but arises from this practiced understanding, right? And so that's what we're just from talking to Venerable Tarva, I was thinking about that as kind of a training-based intuition. It's not like an intuition that comes from the Dharma Dhatu. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying that it comes from the fundamental not knowingness of the universe, which someone might say. But you know, we were suggesting that this comes from the fact that you've had lots and lots of experience in a certain realm. Like, so I was thinking of it in terms of the hospice workers who, like, first of all, they don't just go there not knowing how to work with dying people. They're trained. And then after they get a lot of experience, they get to the point where they can use their training less consciously, more spontaneously, more fluidly, more dynamically, without pigeonholing as much, right? And then you get to maybe some situations where you spontaneously do the right thing, even though it wasn't in any book that you read, because you have, right? And you don't actually, and then you can't. It's hard to explain to the monitors why you did it, because it's because I've been doing this for 25 years or whatever. You know. Yeah, that was very good. Yes, I'll go here.
This is maybe a difficult question, but I was confused. And when you were talking about the things from myself and the things
Yeah.
and his spoken in Mahamudra,
Yeah.
things that you said, this would have come out of the system of reflective.
That's how I understand that. Yeah.
And yet, I have also heard, I think you mentioned here, that basically all the Tibetan systems boil down to holding Yeah. So this, and we saw.
She's saying, didn't Guy say in a previous visit that all the Tibetan systems boil down to, or ultimately the main systems of Tibetan Buddhism ultimately hold the Prasangika view, and then she's going to point out that in the Prasangika view there is no reflexive self-awareness. So then how can it be that the goal of Mahamudra meditation outside of Gelugpa is to settle into this reflexive self-awareness, so you deeply penetrate the nature of the mind, knowing the mind in the moment. Right. Well, the thing about what His Holiness explains it, he tries to separate the object, the mind object that's known from the mind objects that's knowing by an instant, so that you don't have one thing knowing itself, just self-establishing itself as a knower. Okay, so my attempt at answering that is when I'm saying, when I did say something like that about all these systems involving Prasangika, and what I was doing was referring to what His Holiness says in Kindness, Clarity, and Insight. And and the reason His Holiness is, okay, he's saying that because he's applying this principle of charitable interpretation. He wants to if they don't have the Prasangika view, then they can't realize the profound emptiness. If they can't realize the profound emptiness, then none of them could be enlightened. And then he's the Dalai Lama of one group of people that he happens to be a member of that are right, and a whole bunch of other people who are all wrong. And who's supposed awakened, yogis, or not actually getting anywhere close to liberation because they have the wrong view of emptiness. So he, right? So he has he does have an ex officio motivation, and I think then he is able to apply the principle of charity and his intelligence to look into these systems and find ways to understand what they're doing as really, even though they might not have, be saying it or meaning it in the same way that he's taking it, that it ends up from his Prasangika point of view of achieving the same liberating goal. Do you see what I'm saying? So you may have some of these people who say, well, the Dalai Lama says, being nice to us, that we all have the Prasangika view, but I, for one, don't. Because they don't even want to be identified with the Prasangika view. They might think that was from their side, a wrong view. It's a little bit like the, I don't know, it's analogous to, but more subtle than the anonymous Christian idea, right? Or Hindu inclusivism, where you don't want to say that these other people, anonymous Christian is well, that there's lots of people the Bible, as a Christian, is you have to get to heaven through Jesus Christ. Everybody is going to hell or something. And so then I don't want to really believe that everybody in the world who doesn't follow my exact kind of Christianity is going to hell. So I have to believe that some of them, even though they don't call it Christianity, maybe they call it Buddhism, but that they in effect achieve the same thing through their spiritual practices. They don't call it love of Christ or whatever, but they come to the same mind of love that we call the mind of Christ. And so that's a hermeneutic of charitable interpretation. Now the other people might say, well, that's nice of you to count me as a Christian, but I really wasn't aspiring to be included there, right? I had this, Hinduism is famous for this kind of inclusivism. I invited a Hindu to my class one time, a Brahmin priest, and I didn't really know him too well, so I made probably a mistake, right? So I invited him to the class, and the first thing he says to all my 19-year-old students is, "You are all Hindus." And it's like, they're like, well, it certainly got their attention, So that's going a lot farther than what His Holiness is doing, and some people take offense, right, at that kind of aggressive inclusivism. So His Holiness is trying to be he's trying to be subtler about it, but apply a principle of charity, because he's not deviating from his view that Tsongkhapa was correct in his reading of Chandrakirti. He's not saying, oh well, Chandrakirti could be right, but maybe Bhavaveka was right too. He's not saying like that. He's saying, Chandrakirti is correct, and the proper way to interpret that is through Tsongkhapa. And it seems that these other people are attaining liberation, and they have profound things to say. And so how can I, as a follower of Tsongkhapa, understand this as being possible? And then he doesn't just stop with the question. He comes up with these, complicated ways of understanding what they're doing as fulfilling the purposes that he thinks that they need to fulfill. Yeah. So he has maybe in some ways a different understanding of their systems than they might present from their own side. Yeah. That's what I would say about that. Yeah. Yes.
I had a bit of experience in the Buddhism tradition, and I have just to say that this talk was kind of very provoking a lot of thought in me, because I came from the perspective only to, we didn't speak about what we were doing so much. So then I was kind of opening the gate, and what was I doing actually when I was doing the training and that time. And also building the bridge to the tradition and writing Internet. But I have one question more directly to one of the quotes on page 422. It helps from the master by the Buddhism house as an example for all beings, because there's nothing to do. People can trust the theory, because he doesn't now with people. People recognize themselves, and I couldn't understand this.
It's at the top of page 4, and then there's chapter 22 from the Tao Te Ching. Okay, so the not knowing tradition, as I was saying, tends to be not just unsystematic, but sometimes anti-systematic. And so, as frequently comes up in the Tibetan interpretations that outside Gelugpa, a key part of that is that you don't have any claim, you don't have any thesis, you don't have any position. Different phrasings are used, because any kind of thing that you would try to prove is something that you're grasping onto and that you're attached to. So if you're not the idea is that okay, so if I have a certain opinion or position or belief, then the idea is that I'm attached to it and I'm committed to trying to demonstrate it and to defend it, right? So I'm invested in that. And the idea is that because the master, the Taoist master here, doesn't have any agenda then people can trust why his words, because to put it in American colloquial, I mean, he's speaking from the heart. But it's actually, of course, in the Taoist way, he's speaking from the source of all things that's below the individual heart, right? He's speaking from a space where it doesn't have to do with being attached to particular conceptual formations, that people are invested in. And then because he doesn't know who he is, people recognize themselves in him. Well, maybe you can relate this to 24 too. He doesn't have a self-definition. He doesn't have a fixed idea about his own identity. In some sense, you want to say, of course, the whole point of Buddhist practice is to, know ourselves or understand ourselves. But it certainly involves a lot of letting go of who we think we are, and then it opens up into a space where, let's see how to say this. When you let go of all these ideas about who you think you are, and ultimately you find yourself in this not knowing kind of space where there's not, where who you ultimately are is something that nothing can be said about. Right? Like I'm thinking, if you translate it over into Gelugpa way, it would be like, well, as the yogi engages in analysis, seeking to know the final nature of things, such as herself, what does she ultimately come to is a state of mind in which only emptiness appears, right? And so this is sort of like, by analogy, I'm taking this Taoist sage as sort of, is reaching this kind of non-dualistic understanding of not even oneness with the source of, not even oneness, right? Because you're not holding on to an idea of one or many, but non-separation from the source of all things, in which she doesn't hold to a specific idea of who she is in contradistinction to someone else. And therefore, people can see her like a mirror, a reflection of where they're coming from. She's not attached to something specific on her side. She doesn't have any own characteristic to which she's clinging here.
I was thinking maybe for example, in the prison, or even if you have the chance to be in a cabin,
Yeah.
There's so much openness and space in front of you that you yourself have to be in there totally loved and welcome. So, this is something...
You're totally loved and what?
Welcome.
Welcome, totally welcome.
Your mind gets much more space to yourself too.
Yeah.
There's no defensiveness.
That's very good. Yeah, I think so many people have that with His Holiness. It's kind of remarkable, right?
Another question that maybe you mentioned it, but I couldn't understand that it's the quote, I think it was 29, the Mahamudra perspective, and don't let the mind work, and then there's the impression that meditation is about not thinking. And also when I get back about the Zen meditation, I was saying it's so much about not thinking and letting go of thoughts, and I'm a bit confused how to have the meditation where you rely on the basis of the mind, and but otherwise also that you have to use critical conceptual mind to get a deeper understanding. How to combine the two.
Right. Okay, well, we're verging on the limits of my expertise to answer a question like that, but I will say it reminds me a little bit of a couple of things. Okay, so one is Chan Master Sheng Yen. He's always telling people, not to hold on to thoughts, not have any particular goal in mind, and so forth, right? But then he says, well, and this is while you're in meditation. You're not supposed to be sitting there in meditation thinking, I'm trying to get enlightenment or something like that. But he's saying, of course, you have a purpose or reason why you sit down in the first place. And so it's not as though the practice is completely without motivation or purpose or intention. It's just that you use that to propel you into the practice, and then once you're actually doing it, you sort of try to let all of these things go by. And if you can relate that to Shunryu Suzuki's quote that I referred to yesterday from Branching Streams Flow in Darkness, that he's very much focusing on getting people into this sort of open, spacious, beginner's mind kind of thing. But then he's giving a lecture on this, important, historically important text. He's telling them specifically, we can't just chant this and then space out. We have to study what this means, and that's why I'm giving you a lecture on it. And then we'll go into beginner's mind. So it's I would say, it's analogous to what Venerable Tarbo is saying. It's like you don't have this kind of spontaneous responsiveness to people that just rises up one day from the Dharma Dhatu. It comes by working back and forth between working with study and conceptuality, and then letting that soak into your mind without always, wrestling with it, and then letting it go back and forth between experience and analysis, so that you get to a certain point where you can respond from a kind of, I don't know, I say body wisdom, some people talk about, or whatever. It's like something that's pre-conscious. That's what Sung San's trying to point out, where he says we have to get to our before-thinking mind. So, yeah, but it's from my point of view, it's sort of hard to just tell people that at the beginning. When they haven't actually thought anything. They don't know anything about the Dharma, and say, stop thinking. And so I wasn't. I was waiting for you to tell me something to think about. Now what you're telling me is I should think about not thinking, or not think. But, it's so, anyway, that's the problem. That's why I'm, a Tsongkhapa person, not. But because I have a hard time with that as a starting point. But I understand it as somewhere that we want to get, right? Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting, I'm thinking about the question of the Theravada tradition and insight meditation, try out and really focus on sensation and bringing the mind to sensation, where you're not actually in the medical, but in Theravada meditation, the sensation, bringing the mind to, so finding in myself now, instrument that spiritual development from the foundation of Theravada and Buddhism. I don't have it for anything, but I see where sometimes when I'm in a meditation, where I go back and forth between analysis and bringing the mind quiet to the
sensation. The last part of what you're saying is definitely the case. Is that analysis for people like me can lead to excessive discursiveness, where your mind just races and you get tangled up in your own thoughts. And going back to stabilizing your mind on your breath is like a necessary counterbalance to the kind of, what do you say, craving for analysis or whatever kind of thing that goes on. And then, so that I would definitely agree with. And in general, if you extend that, into a bodhisattva kind of practice, that's what the bodhisattva is doing in the first phases of the path, certainly, is, alternating between analytical thinking and then and stabilizing the mind. And then when you're stabilizing the mind on what it is that you've learned through analysis, the force of that analysis deteriorates and you lose track of the emptiness that you're trying to stabilize your mind on. So you have to go back to analyze some more and refresh the sense of things as being empty, and then stabilize the mind again, right? And eventually, you get to a point where these two come together and they're working hand in hand instead of seesawing, I guess is the right way to put it. And but to go back to the earlier part of what you're saying, though, this is a complicated topic about what is Theravada mindfulness meditation. I haven't really talked about this because I don't really feel like I know enough. I feel like this is something that Venerable Chodron has been studying a lot more than I have. roughly speaking, there's a way in which mindfulness meditation, in coming not just into psychology but into Western Buddhism, has been moved away from the idea of discriminating or discerning what it is we're experiencing toward the direction of just being, in some sense, without discerning and discriminating. So that's why I put that little thing from this whole, that goes back to the teachings of the Buddha. And when Buddha taught the foundations of mindfulness, he didn't say, stop thinking and rest your mind in empty space. That never comes up. He said, right in there, and it's right. He said, he says when a bhikkhu knows that when a bhikkhu's taking a long breath, he knows that he's taking a long breath. And drinking a glass of cold water, then he knows that he's drinking a glass of cold water. And it uses all these kinds of words about knowing specific things is what it means to be mindful. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So I think this is probably one of those things that's complicated enough to say that there's a whole spectrum, not just a right way and a wrong way. And I just started to get a feel for a little bit what the variables are along the spectrum. But, when people say, that any kind of, there's the ones, people who say, well, that conceptuality is part of mindfulness, and then people who say, well, we should stop thinking in order to truly be meditating, right? And then in between you have some other possibilities. And then the same is true with the other variables about whether you're supposed to be making an effort or this is just supposed to be happening spontaneously and so forth. So, do you understand what I'm saying? There's kind of a range. So we just go mindfulness meditations and we know we're talking about a thing. But it's actually just like Buddhism. If you don't know, then you think that that's a thing. Right? Yeah, but it's just so many different things to different people. Yeah.
A comment in frame of questions, I guess. I've had the last thing explained to me in the sense of sensory direct perception almost. Well, that's just what you try. When you look at a tree, you need to say in your head, it's a tree, versus just seeing the whole thing. Because I guess when you look at your eyes, it's much more you see than you can actually mentally say. That's how I gathered it real quick, but I don't know if that's valid or right. But then my question is about Prabhupada's dual ornament of liberation.
Yeah.
And I guess where he's talking about the Buddha and Newland. And it was about the two different types of primordial wisdom.
Yeah.
Which the term primordial, but it seems
I mean,
what you're talking, because it seems like it presupposes beginning.
Oh yeah. Okay. Is that the question?
It's part of it.
Oh.
But then, the
I can answer that.
They seem very similar because
the two wisdoms.
Yeah, the examples he gives under the second one seem like they're talking about seeing it as an illusion, which then I read as reality as it is. I don't really. It seems very similar to me.
Okay. All right. The first thing. The word is in Sanskrit is yeshe, which is like glosses yene sheba, and it's so it has that sense of sort of a wisdom that has always been there, or something like that. So. People have different understandings then of what that, should we translate it as fundamental wisdom, or should we call it exalted wisdom, which is what Jeffrey was doing? Does it really intend to be making some claim that a fully developed Buddhist mind has been there from the beginning of time? Well, obviously that goes back to the question of whether you're an innatist or a constructivist or where you fall on the spectrum. Some people will say that, yeah, these primordial wisdom, if it exists, if it's being posited in a certain system, is like a fundamental mind that's existed from the beginning. And the problem is that we've overlaid some delusory concepts upon the top of it and prevented its clarity from shining out. But then other people, will understand it in a constructivist way, and they'll think of primordial doesn't mean since the beginning of time. It means sort of a fundamental or kind of wisdom that is a fulfillment of the potential we've had since the beginning of time. Okay. So in the second part of the question, the gist of this is that the number one, he's talking about sort of yeshe or sublime wisdom, primordial wisdom that knows, what do we say, the ultimate truth, ultimate reality. And then what he calls omniscience is the one that knows anything else that might happen to be existing, if there is anything. And so that's what he's saying. There's these two kinds of things. And people, it's like he's just sort of acknowledging it. The world is complicated. There are lots of different teachers out there, and some, don't think Buddha has either of these, and some think he has both, and plus he has some thoughts too, and some focus on one and more on one and the other and say different things. So it's kind of interesting that he gives us a little, not extremely clear, but a little bit of overview of, the field of ideas as he understood it at the time and how they were justified. And so, he quotes some sutras, which I don't give all here, to try to say that, there are sutras that suggest that Buddha knows ultimate reality. And then in addition, he quotes several texts which are sort of supposed to be pointing at the idea that Buddha knows conventional things. Now what you're pointing at, I think, is the unsurpassed Tantra, where they say, through greatest compassion, knowing all worlds, having seen all worlds. In what way is it seen and known? It is not like seeing phenomena as real. It is seen as understood as illusion. Exactly. The point isn't that Buddha sees tables and chairs as existing the way they appear to us, but he sees them. He doesn't come to a sublime wisdom wherein it's understood that these things don't exist at all, according to this system that's being explained here, which should be in line with, in the direction of where these are the kinds of texts that Tsongkhapa would quote. In fact, I think he quotes the meeting of Father and Son quite a lot. So, yeah, it's like the omniscient one is praised in this way of understanding because of simultaneously being able to know correctly and directly and accurately all conventional phenomena without taking them as being objectively real from their own side, because simultaneously, directly, unconfusedly knowing their ultimate nature as empty. Right. And so it's of course there's stuff in here about how these things are illusory, but that doesn't mean they're non-existent. Right? That's the whole point, is that they still appear. And if the idea is if you say that they're just complete hallucinations and that waking up means you don't see them at all, then you would say, well, what we call omniscience is just a name for getting rid of all these appearances which are ultimately non-existent. Illusion-like, for Tsongkhapa, right, in the system, doesn't mean that things don't exist at all. It means they don't exist as they appear. So it implies that they do exist in some way, and of course Buddha would know them. Yeah.
So then my follow-up with that, well, so a Buddha got rid of wisdom, but then he got rid of ignorance, sorry.
I thought we were going down the rabbit's hole again, yeah.
Then, you get rid of ignorance, then there's no longer the nameless form and then consciousness. So is he going back and forth between ignorance and non-ignorance, conventionally and ultimately at the same time?
No. Yeah, I think I read something sort of giving a quick overview of Tsongkhapa's ideas about Buddha's mind. But so, yeah, Buddha rests within direct, non-dualistic understanding of emptiness, and attains to, on the verge of becoming Buddha to a certain point where that final realization of emptiness, moment of realization of emptiness, eradicates the last obstructions to omniscience, the last subtle obstructions to being able to see all things that exist simultaneously. That's what it. So the idea is that then, without rising from meditate or divert, doesn't mean just standing up or not standing up. It's without coming out of, even to the least degree, this full absorption, in emptiness, which for every other yogi would mean not seeing, below that would mean not seeing tables and chairs and people temporarily. But for Buddha, then these things appear with perfect clarity while simultaneously resting in that. So this is the idea of what omniscience means for Tsongkhapa, and not just Tsongkhapa. He has all kinds of sources that he traces it to. But anyway, it's clear that not every Buddhist goes down that path. In part because their idea, it has to do with what do you take this stuff to be? If you're willing to say that tables exist, right, then you want Buddha to be someone who knows them. And if you think the very idea that a table exists in any sense whatsoever is what we mean by delusion, then of course Buddha's wisdom will be one in which any trace of that notion is eradicated. Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that I was planning to talk about more in the emptiness phase, which we still have time for this afternoon. But did you have a question? No? No? Okay. You do, Sean.
Back in my 20s, when I was doing a backpacking on the early point, I was carried around a lot of music.
Uh-huh.
One of the quotes that came back to me when I was talking about what he was doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's called the Navy Daredevil. Fox look into the abyss. And I kept thinking of that when he was talking to Skeffy spoke about it as a sweet darkness. Yes.
And I thought, are we talking about the same kind of darkness?
Yeah.
Where there's, where God is dead,
Uh-huh.
a sweet darkness where you kind of
Right.
open up doors of compassion.
Right. Well, yeah, that's one of the things, I don't know. I hate to be pronouncing about Nietzsche, but I really don't want to. But the general idea is that he was a very intelligent person who had an acute ability to deconstruct and see the weak links in all of the conceptual structures that people were holding on to make sense out of the world at that time. This is an answer to the question that was asked before about does not knowing immediately lead to loving actions. No, it doesn't necessarily lead to. I'm not saying that he realized emptiness, but he realized the falseness of a lot of things that people were holding on to make sense of things. And he's pretty scathing in the way he expressed some of these things. And so maybe sometimes within some portions of his mind that was motivated by an intention to help other people become free from the false consolation of the idols, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's principle of charity. That's all I can say. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
I was thinking the relations with when you said
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I don't. If there are no more questions, it seems way. Well, maybe I could do one of my little small things to end because we have 7 minutes or something. Let's see. Well, you're talking about how the Buddha knows things, and what enlightenment is like. This came up a little bit. So I'll just read what His Holiness said. An edited version of what he said at Lehigh about taking refuge in the three jewels. So the Buddhist is one who goes for refuge to the three jewels for refuge. And when these objects are described in text, objects of refuge are described in text, the Buddha is usually described as the supreme among bipeds. humans and so forth. And the Dharma is described as the supreme teaching or the supreme truth, the truth free from attachment, which is peace. And the Sangha is described as the supreme assembly. But if we understand the nature and characteristics of the three jewels only in this way, it's not anything unique to Buddhism. I really like that. It says, other spiritual traditions take refuge, and such qualities as these in their objects of refuge are often present. Most, and maybe all, spiritual traditions see their own original teacher as being the supreme human being, and they will also say that their spiritual teaching represents a truth that is peaceful and beyond attachment, and they have some sort of notion of a spiritual community, like a church or the Ummah in Islam and so forth. So if you understand the three jewels just to this extent, he sort of pointedly asks us, how can you even say that you're going for refuge in the three jewels in a way that defines your practice as Buddhist? Now, people do say this, but how can they really explain it? We have to cultivate a deeper understanding of the nature of Buddha and the nature of Dharma. What is the nature of the Buddha to whom we go for refuge? And what is the particular nature of the Sangha that we, as Buddhists, perceive to be the supreme community? So then he mostly talks about the Buddha. And he says, with respect to the Buddha, there's a divergence of opinion within the tradition. As I mentioned, some maintain that when Buddha attained final nirvana, the entire continuum of Buddha's existence came to an end. The other view, which Tsongkhapa shares, involves an understanding of Buddhahood in terms of the four bodies. Here, the idea of an absolute end to the continuity of Buddha's existence is rejected. And then he points out that Nagarjuna, in 60 stanzas of reasoning, makes an argument against the idea that final nirvana, that Buddha could attain a final nirvana without residue, that concept. Because, he says, while the person's alive, then this final nirvana hasn't been attained. But when the final nirvana is attained, there's no person there anymore under the interpretation that's been given. Therefore, this is Nagarjuna's argument, actually. I looked it up, but I don't have the quote, but he says basically this. So the idea of someone's attaining nirvana without any sort of residue, just if you phrase it like that, isn't coherent, because you either have the person or the non-existence of the person, but you can't have the person having their own attainment to non-existence. So then he talks about how there's so much difference between arhats and Buddhas in the Mahayana way of understanding that it just seems that you could not attain to Buddhahood based on practicing the 37 aspects of enlightenment, such as the 4 establishments of mindfulness and the Eightfold Noble Path as understood in non-Mahayana traditions. He said Buddhas cannot simply be those who have done these same practices for a very, very long period of time, because there's such a big difference. So the path to Buddhahood must also include other practices besides the 37, such as the 6 far-reaching attitudes. Is that what you say? 6 perfections, 6 far-reaching attitudes. We have many mental states that are distorted due to being grounded in a false way of understanding and perceiving the world. These mental states can be stopped and brought to an end by powerful antidotes to these false ways of knowing. But the essential quality of mind itself is clear and knowing. Unlike ignorance and delusion, which can be eliminated, there are no forces or reasons that can appear and block the continuum of mind as clear and knowing from going forward. There isn't anything that can undermine the continuing existence of the fundamental quality of the mind itself. From the highest Yoga Tantra point of view, when we understand how consciousness operates at a very subtle level, there are 2 characteristics. One is the knowing aspect, and right with it there is a moving, dynamic aspect that we could call energy, or wind energy. These 2 aspects are inseparable, and that neither can exist without the other. So consciousness continues to exist at this very subtle level, right together with this energy. When a person gains full enlightenment, the consciousness itself, being dependently arisen, is fundamentally empty. And this emptiness is the ultimate nature of the mind. When one attains Buddhahood, this emptiness is the nature body, the fundamental nature, called the body of Buddha as nature, as Buddha's body as the very nature of reality. While the ordinary person's mind is pure and unpolluted in its essential nature, it is still tainted by adventitious pollutants and stains. And when one attains Buddhahood, these adventitious pollutants are removed, so the natural purity of the mind, which is its fundamental nature, is now accompanied by an attained purity, a purity that's been attained through cultivation of the path. Therefore, the emptiness of the mind, the very nature of the person's mind, becomes the natural embodiment of the Buddha. At that point, the person's consciousness becomes a Buddha's embodiment of truth as wisdom, Nishichirgu. And the energy accompanying that wisdom mind becomes the Buddha's embodiment as form. Within the Buddha's embodiment as form, there are the speech and physical qualities of a Buddha. You have Buddha's body, speech, and mind, right? So the speech and the physical qualities of a Buddha, he's putting in the embodiment of form. Buddhahood is thus a state in which body, speech, and mind have become totally inseparable in a single nature, because they're all expressions of the unity of the very subtlest mind and the very subtlest energy. The effort to attain Buddhahood is fundamentally motivated by an altruistic intention for the work for the welfare of an infinite number of living beings for as long as space remains and to the furthest reaches of space. Once Buddhahood is attained, the Buddha does not cease to exist. The motivation for practice on the Bodhisattva path comes to fruition in an awakened being who goes on acting for the benefit of all living beings for as long as space remains. Understanding Buddhahood in this way will change your understanding of the object of refuge. Maitreya's Sublime Continuum also tells us that a key quality of the Dharma is that it is not just freedom from attachment, it's beyond any concept, beyond anything we can imagine, beyond any verbal expression. And the Sangha is a community of practitioners who embody a Dharma that has these inconceivable characteristics. When you have this kind of understanding of the three jewels, it transfigures your understanding of that to which you go for refuge as a Buddha. Implicitly, going for refuge to the three jewels becomes a reaffirmation of your philosophical understanding of the Buddha's teachings. Becoming a Buddhist in philosophical terms converges with the act of going for refuge. Okay. I read quite a bit. I read, let's see. Oh gosh. I read starting on page 44 all the way to the end of page 47. Okay. Okay, that's enough. Later on we'll do, I'll talk about emptiness. I'm going to try to start at a very basic space using Jeffrey's Dharma talks, and then before the end I'll try to get in, my two or three, we'll see, quintessential points for understanding the magic of what Tsongkhapa's magic key to reading Chandrakirti in a way that's non-nihilistic. Okay.